Welcome Life Science learners to another installment. Trust that you guys are excited and glad to be here. What are we looking at today? Well, we continue with human reproduction. Today we're going to focus on fertilization, birth and contraception. It's important that we understand the process of fertilization for us to then move on to the process of birth and what happens during the birth process. So let's get straight into the details of our lesson, and I trust that you guys are making notes and you're having those questions that you're writing down, and I hope that you can engage with me through the session and I'll answer those questions for you. So it's important that we understand exactly what we're doing today. In our overview, we're looking at fertilization and the development of zygote, and that's important for us to be able to understand how pregnancy and the further development occurs post-fertilization. So what is fertilization and what happens after fertilization? It's a concept that we've been introduced to several years ago. Fertilization or fusion is an alternative word. And so we see that fertilization is a process of the sperm traveling towards the egg and fusing with the egg. So fertilization is the coming together of the male gamete and the female gamete to produce what we refer to as a zygote. Now let's try and understand why this is important. It's important in the context of sexual reproduction that two gametes come together to produce an offspring that has a combination of genetic information from two different individuals. So fertilization is a process in which the haploid gametes, which are the sperm and eggs, fuse together to form a diploid zygote. So remember that haploid is N plus the other N equals to a diploid cell being the zygote having information from two different haploid cells. And this process of fertilization occurs after ovulation when a sperm cell travels up the fallopian tube and fuses with an ovum. It's important that we understand when fertilization takes place. Fertilization will occur when there is an egg that's available, provided that sperms have been introduced into the female reproductive system. So that sperm will travel to hopefully fuse and meet with this egg inside the fallopian tube. And that is where fertilization happens. It happens in the fallopian tube. So here's a beautiful image showing you several sperm cells that are making that mammoth journey all the way from the process of ejaculation all up into the fallopian tube. So this is inside the fallopian tube, and where we see this egg cell, and a sperm cell will then release an enzyme allowing for this membrane to rupture open, allowing the head of the sperm to enter. Once the head of the sperm enters, it is able to release the nucleus. And so that process is actually a beautiful process illustrated in this diagram. Let's look at what happens after fertilization. So we have identified that fertilization is the fusion of the gametes. So let's step back to looking at the female reproductive system. We know that here is an image of the ovary. I'm going to change my pen so that I make that much more distinct for you. So we see the ovaries here, and we know that ovulation takes place at the ovary where an ova is released. That ova travels, or is moved along rather, into the fallopian tube in anticipation of a sperm cell. So this image shows you several sperm cells being released. So ovulation generally happens around day 14, and so that egg travels into the fallopian tube after day 14. If sperm cells are introduced into the female reproductive system, these sperm cells will move towards the egg. And often I get the question, how do the sperm cells know where to move towards? And so what we see is these sperm cells are attracted by a process called chemotaxis, where there's a chemical stimulus that draws them, that is released by the egg. So the sperm cells will move towards the area where the egg is because of the chemical affinity between the sperm cells and the egg cells. So there is a chemical stimulus that is sensed by these sperm cells that draws them up into the fallopian tube. And so they will then travel and they will fuse with this to form what we call the zygote. And that happens generally soon after ovulation. That zygote will then undergo a series of cell division called mitosis, and specifically the embryo will divide to form a multi-cell structure by around day 4 called the morula. And the morula comes from the word many cells or mulberry-like structure. And so by day 5, this ball of cells now becomes a bit more specialized, showing differentiation in cells. And so we say that that's the blastocyst. And once it reaches the size of a blastocyst, we know that this now has entered into the uterine chamber, where it will then implant against or into the endometrial lining in the uterus. So this is the development of the zygote post-fertilization. So here's a schematic diagram showing you the early development of the embryo. And we see here a zygote that is obviously a fertilized egg cell undergoing a series of cell division, forming the morula, and that morula in turn becomes a specialized cell called or structure called the blastocyst. And only then can this blastocyst be attached into the endometrium. Here are images showing you an ultrasound image of the zygote. Again, you can see here the nuclei fusing together. We see that that zygote undergoes a series of divisions by around day 4 to form a ball of cells called the morula. You can see that there are several cells in this collective structure. And then we see the specialization of this to form a larger ball with a bit more differentiation in the types of cells in this. And this blastocyst is now ready to be implanted. And so this is another image that shows you the development along from the point of fertilization to becoming the morula to then the blastocyst attaching onto the lining of the endometrium. And that process we refer to as is called implantation. I have a beautiful image here which I'd like to show to you. So here we're seeing the blastocyst. I'm going to change my pen because that's red and I'll make that a bit more clear for you. We're seeing this blastocyst, guys, which is a complex ball that have got these cells that have differentiated slightly different, that are now able to attach onto this endometrial lining. And this is the endometrium, and we're inside the uterus where this ball that has formed now is able to attach. And so, guys, this process of attachment onto the endometrial lining, which is a vascularized layer in the uterus, is called implantation. So the word planting is essentially pointing to the growth and attachment. So there's an attachment that forms between this blastocyst. And once that blastocyst is attached, we say that now there's successful attachment and we see the next process of development occurring. So guys, we've looked at the process of what happens when fertilization occurs. We've discussed eventually how this ball of cells develops to become a complex ball called the blastocyst. And now we've looked at the successful attachment of that blastocyst onto the endometrium. And that is called implantation. So guys, you've been very attentive. You deserve a little break, short break, and then I see you back at the end of that break.